Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today or coming in person to... Sorry, microphones were off, but thank you, everyone, for coming today or watching us on Grassroots TV or the Pitkin County channel. It is December 8th, and this is the work session of the Aspen City Council, and we are going to be learning about all the work that's been done with the housing assessments to be able to comply with state law and state funding requirements. So please take it away. Thank you. We appreciate your work.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Good evening, afternoon, Council. So Liz Axberg, Housing Policy Analyst in the City Manager's Office. I'm here with Rachel Shinman from Economic and Planning Systems, who has been leading the work on our housing needs assessment and will be really leading the presentation today. But I just wanted to make a couple comments and just talk a little bit about the real purpose of today's work session and the slides we're going to show today. It really is just the first check-in on this housing needs assessment. We're updating you where we're at in it, the current data that we have, which we included in your packet as well, and where we're going from here as well. And so we're really thinking of it as an update because we still have to complete the remaining components of the housing needs assessment. And right now, what has been completed is the essential components for us to submit the AMI petition to Proposition 123 and hopefully qualify for some additional funding from that revenue. And so we started this work back in February with EPS and have been working with towns and counties from Garfield and Picken County. And next steps is we're going to complete the next phase of this housing needs assessment, which is the remaining requirements to comply with Senate Bill 174. And I also want to say that right after this, we're going to Town of Snowmass Village to share this data with them, and tomorrow we're going to the Board of County Commissioners. So today, if we get out in time, we're trying to be in person at Town of Snowmass Village as well, just so you know.
What time do they start?
We're last on the agenda, so 5:30, but also I want to make sure you all feel like you can ask questions today. And I'll also say we're happy to field questions after this or even sit down with counselors one-on-one to talk through data as well.
Bill?
Could you give us a brief reminder of what Prop 123 is, what it does, and why we're going through this housing needs assessment? Ultimately, not sort of the specifics of why we're checking the boxes, but what we're hoping to accomplish with Prop 123, please.
Yeah, of course. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about it too, but I'll just say, so that's the State Affordable Housing Fund. And so you can apply for different projects for large amounts of funding from Prop 123, and except the strings attached as the different programs within it are AMI restricted. And a lot of the AMIs that are set out in that—
AMI for the audience?
Oh, of course, area median income. And so a lot of the area median income that it's restricted to use the funding for doesn't really align with what we have going in our community. And so this housing needs assessment really needs to prove that we have housing needs at higher income levels, so that way we can submit a petition to basically say, we'd like to qualify for funding that serves these higher income levels, and that actually works for who is in our community. Because as we know, housing at many different income levels need assistance, so.
Thanks, Liz. And how much total funding is allocated in Prop 123?
Let me just—
It was $300 million total. I believe now it's 200. There was some rearranging for state budget issues over 3 years or 5 years. And so it's a set aside of state income tax, I believe, that was approved by the voters in 2023, I think, but don't quote me on that.
Thanks. And in a realistic scenario, if we do everything right, we fill out all our forms, we get this waiver that you're going to talk about, how much could Aspen or our region potentially benefit from?
I mean, potentially like millions of dollars, depending on the what program we apply for. And that being said, we also just think it's really important to submit this petition just to really show the state the economic situation that Aspen's in and the need for housing in our region as well. So of course, hopefully we can get some funding, or even getting this petition allows others who are developing housing in our region potentially to utilize dollars from that as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, and then just one more note on Prop 123, and that's not the focus of the conversation, but there's also, a commitment made to add a certain number of units over a certain period of time, and getting approved for the income petition means that we can count units at those higher income levels as well, regardless of how they're built.
That's actually a great point, because without it, you can only count units that are within their parameters of the program.
Yeah, and Bill, I was going to say, I think those are great questions for really framing this work. Nobody likes to do busy work or work that's not going to result in something. But at least from my experience with the state legislature, you never know what will happen in 26, 27, 28 in terms of adding more money to the pot or adding a new pot and saying, but the qualifier is that you did this work before. So, this will.
And just for clarity, I wasn't suggesting that this wasn't worth pursuing.
No. I wasn't suggesting that either. I was just saying I think those were good questions for framing the purpose, and it may carry on far beyond 123 is kind of what I was saying.
Yeah, and so while, our hands are a little tied in terms of some of the analysis that needed to be done by state legislation, and I still think some of this data is really interesting and shows the need for housing in our community, in our region, and the trends that have been going on since our last housing needs assessment. So from here, I'll let Rachel take it. And one thing that also Rachel's going to say again and again during this is a housing needs assessment. It doesn't need to be adopted by council, nor does it tell us how many units we really need to build or say you need to build this many. It's really just data on what's going on in terms of housing need here. And from here, we'll, of course, finish out the remaining components of the housing needs assessment, and then the legislation also will require a housing action plan, which we'll talk about in future work session, I'm sure, and that's the piece that actually needs to be adopted by City Council.
Perfect. Let's see if this gets up. Full screen. There we go. Okay, so we're gonna dive into it. There's a lot of data in the presentation. I'm gonna go pretty quickly through the first set of slides. It's really just laying the groundwork and setting the story of what is happening in the region, and then focus on some of the numbers at the end that help us frame the conversation of how we're thinking about housing needs in the region. As Liz said, these aren't mandates. It's not when we see a number, it's not we must build this many units. It's helping us understand the magnitude of need and where that need is coming from. And so, as was mentioned, this is a regional effort. We have most of the same partners as the 2018 Housing Needs Assessment. And so this is a little bit of an update of that, and then also, as was mentioned, complying with new state requirements. It's also, not a new thing. Sorry, the screens just went off. Oh, there we go. In this region. And so Aspen has been talking about housing and doing housing needs assessments more than most places in the state, the country. And so we're just updating the conversation and making sure that we're understanding how things are changing and how we might want to change our thinking and approach to housing. And so again, the purpose primarily is to meet the requirements of Senate Bill 24-174, which requires communities across the state to do housing needs assessments. This is almost the same thing we would have done regardless to update the previous assessment. And so there's just some tweaks in the methodology and how we present the data. And then, like we mentioned, it gives us the basis to apply for Proposition 123 funding and also for the income waiver, and then just generally plan for housing in the region and build collaboration. Having our conversations with representatives from Aspen through to Parachute is really helpful to understand, across the region, the commute shed, how everyone is thinking about housing and contributing. And so there are a lot of components. Like I said, we're going to run through the data relatively quickly. These 6 components are what we're calling phase 1 of this, and this is giving us a core needs assessment document that can be submitted to the state for the Proposition 123 components, and then we'll be doing phase 2, which is rounding out the Senate Bill 174 needs assessment. And so there's a lot of letters and numbers in there. But at the end of this, we will have a complete housing needs assessment with what we're seeing today and then some additional context that we'll be adding later.
Can I just ask,
Yeah.
What are they looking for under the title housing problems?
That's a great question. I was also part of the team that came up with the methodology for this, and as we were drafting the document, I was like, this is a little bit of a strange title. It's cost burden, development challenges is in there also. It's like homelessness, it's overcrowding, it's some of those components.
Okay, so is it also aging homes that people cannot afford to keep up with anymore, or aging mobile homes?
Yeah, it can really be locally centered, and so anything that, there's general issues that affect communities across the state, and then there's things that are more locally based, and so even things like if someone can afford their home but can't afford to heat it in the winter,
Right.
that type of context can be added there as well.
Okay, because I do think that one of the bigger issues we're facing is going to be aging inventory, and with income-capped residents, the ability to repair and bring it back up to speed. And that's a kind of a different issue than most might be facing who don't have an aging inventory.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And that's definitely something that can be in there. And then just also the nature of turnover in affordable inventory and what that looks like. And to your point, what some of the constraints on that might be with
Quality of the unit.
appreciation caps and what people might perceive as what they can get back from capital improvements versus what might actually be allowed. And that's something we've run into in a lot of communities where there's an opportunity for increased education and communication there because people are, afraid to invest in their property because they don't think that they can get that money back.
Correct. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, we'll run through these relatively quickly. This is just the baseline data that helps us understand what's going on in the region and how things are changing. And so most of this probably won't be a surprise. It's the same type of data that will come up in a lot of different conversations. Generally speaking, we're seeing faster growth in Garfield County than in Pitkin, and this is expected to continue in the future. That said, generally speaking, this is based on the State Demography Office, and they're going to sort of forecast trends out based on current conditions. So that's not to say that this is set in stone. If we want to look at big policy changes, this can be potentially changed. But this is based on sort of forecasting out current conditions. This is one of my favorite graphics we've developed throughout this process. This is population by age, and we have the 2 counties overall at the top and then communities down the bottom, and we kind of go down valley and then down the Colorado River Valley, and that dark blue bar is the population under age 25. And so we can really see where families are, and it's really, down the Roaring Fork Valley and then really down the Colorado River Valley. And a little bit of the opposite in the older population, but every community is seeing an aging population. But what's interesting to us as we look at this and what it means for housing is that families are continuing to move out of this region and really even down away from Glenwood and Newcastle. So that's our very quick population trend. In the report, there will be, like 10 pages on demographics. In terms of economics, so there's a lot of text on this slide. What we're seeing here is really interesting. And so Garfield County has more jobs than Pitkin County, but there's also more population there. And so that's not necessarily unexpected. But we're also seeing more job growth in Garfield County than Pitkin County. And so what we're seeing is this shift not only of, families and population down valley, but jobs as well. And so that's something that over time we want to better understand. And then when we look at what types of jobs are still here, it's what we would expect with a generally tourism-based economy. And so a lot of accommodation and food services, a lot of arts and recreation, a lot of retail. The recreation would include ski jobs. And then what we're also seeing is that a lot of workers are coming in from outside the county. And so that 62% is a large number, but that's also not necessarily unexpected given the geography of the region. And so if you're living in Carbondale and working in the Pitkin County part of Basalt, you are commuting from outside of the county, but that's, a shorter commute than living in Parachute and working in Glenwood Springs, where you technically live and work in Garfield County. And so that's not necessarily a surprise. But then we break down the commuters by distance, and that's when we start to understand the nature of commuting. And so those numbers at the bottom are of all workers. We can't get the in-commuters broken down by distance just because of the data source. But what we see is that a quarter of people who work in the county are commuting over 50 miles each way. And another 17% are commuting 25 to 50 miles. And so when we start to look at the long commutes, that's when we start to understand more of the nature of the job shed. And then looking at the types of jobs people have, there's really a range. And so again, there's a lot of numbers on this slide. We're looking at the median wage by different occupations is that middle column, and then the 25th percentile. So a quarter of people make up to that wage. In the 75th percentile, 25% of people make over that in the other two. And what we see is that a lot of the occupations with the most jobs also have the lowest wages. And as we start to make some of these connections, we can expect that a lot of those employees are people driving long distances. So then we get into the question of housing. And so the first question is, well, how much housing do we have? There is more housing in Garfield County than Pickens County. Also not unexpected, there are more people that live there. But Garfield County is adding housing faster than Pickens. That said, Basalt had the fastest growth since 2015. That's both the Eagle County and the Pickens County portions of Basalt. If you ever want a data quagmire, try to include Basalt in a county estimate and get county totals and percentages and things don't add up. It's fun, we love it. So then the second question is, well, how much affordable housing is there? Because we know that just looking at housing units on their own doesn't really tell us the whole story. And there's a lot. There are almost 4,500 affordable housing units in the region, and over 90% of those are in Pickens County, and 65% of those are in Aspen. And so there is a lot of affordable housing in the region, and there's a lot of affordable housing in Aspen. And so what this tells us is we're not starting from scratch. We are looking to continue the success that we've had. We're already doing a lot. We're just looking to build on that.
Can I ask a clarifying?
Yeah.
When you say affordable housing, that's deed restricted housing, or is it just affordable?
Yeah, so that's a great question. This does not include naturally occurring affordable housing. This is just programmatic affordable.
Okay.
So some type of restriction on it. So then also helping us understand the nature of housing is how much housing is actually occupied. As we would expect, there are a lot of vacant units, and a lot more in Pickens County than Garfield County. And in some places, when something is vacant, we would expect it is empty to be rented or sold. In our mountain communities, and particularly our mountain resort communities, we generally assume it is a non-primary home. We've kind of stopped using second home because it might be a third, fourth, fifth home, but it is a non-primary home. It is not, sitting on the market. And so what we see is across the county, just over 40% of units are vacant. In Aspen, it's about 45%, which is an increase from 2010, and yet still lower than a lot of other mountain resort communities in the state. So thinking about like Vail and Breckenridge, they're at like 60 and 70%. And when we think about why that is, well, there's a lot of programmatic affordable housing units in the city, and some of that is just because we've been having these conversations for over 50 years. And so that, we can see the progress and the impact of that. And so while there's still challenges, we're making progress. And then we get to the housing market. So what is happening in the market? It's expensive, as anyone could imagine. So the median sale price of a single-family residence in Aspen in 2024 was $7.3 million. There is nowhere in the region where you can buy just a single-family home for less than $1.5 million. So then people look at townhomes and condos. Townhomes are less expensive, but still, $1.25 million median price. So that's half are sold for less, half are sold for more. And outside of Aspen, the median price for townhomes doubled or nearly doubled almost everywhere between 2020 and 2024. Aspen actually saw less of a price increase through COVID than other communities did, but part of that is just because prices were already so high. And that is similar to trends that we've seen in places like Vail, where prices are already high, and so even if they're increasing, they're just not increasing as much as other places. And so a lot of people look at condominiums as their, non-programmatic affordable housing, and that's the only unit type where there was a median sale price under $1 million in 2024, but still not what we would necessarily call affordable to people living and working in the community. And we've seen significant price increases in all communities for condos since 2020. And so they're just increasingly out of reach. So whereas in the past, someone could potentially buy a condo, it's just increasingly out of reach. And so what happens when people can't buy homes? They look for places to rent. So on this slide, you'll see just the Glenwood Springs metro area rents. And if you talk to anyone who does housing work, you'll probably hear the same story that rental data is one of the hardest data sets to get. It's not, not tracked the same way that home sales are. We're lucky to have really really helpful realtor partners who get us the home sale data. And so we have a really, really strong understanding of what's happening in the for sale market. Rental data is just harder. We still have some data sources we're looking at. And so in the report, there will be Picken specific, Aspen specific data. We're looking at some of the previous studies that were done, since COVID, and then just some other data sources as well. But generally speaking, rents are going up.
On this slide, it doesn't say, is that the cost per bedroom?
So that's the cost per unit. And it,
So it's a 3-bedroom for 1,800 would be
Well,
very affordable.
yeah,
But what are you talking
it's
about?
also the median rent. So if, let's say, half of units are studios and 1-bedrooms and half of units are 2-bedrooms and 3-bedrooms, we would expect this to be for a 1-bedroom unit.
Okay.
That said, in focus groups and other conversations we've had for other work that we're doing in the region, people are talking about, $2,500 for a 1-bed in Glenwood.
Yeah.
And so we know that this data is not great. And that's why we're looking at multiple data sources to bring in to supplement it.
And I appreciate how hard it is to track any of this down or nail it down for more than a day before it all changes. But I think that you should include something that clarifies what type of unit you're talking about, or even if it's because we're extrapolating that it's a 1-bedroom,
Yeah.
as you present to the other partners.
Definitely. And a lot of times, and especially in the report, we'll try and get it at the price per bedroom, which, doesn't always scale. A 1-bedroom unit is not going to be the same. You can't necessarily
As a
multiply that
3-bedroom.
by 3 to get a 3-bedroom, but it gives us a better sense of what it takes. And then a lot of times in communities where we know that people are sharing units because they have to, it helps to understand what the individual cost is for the unit. And what we're seeing now is it's about $1,500 a person if you want to share.
1,800 for
unit.
the bedroom, 600 for the
Yeah.
couch.
Right, exactly. Potentially more than that. We heard so we just finished a similar study in Eagle County, and it was 14 people in one mobile home, each paying $800 a month. That was the most shocking thing I heard in that study, and there were a lot of shocking things that came out of,
I believe it.
it was a lot.
Okay.
And so the affordability piece, so this is just a lot of income limits. We don't have to stare at this, but essentially the median income, so half of people earn more, half of people earn less for a 2-person household is about $100,000. And that's actually pretty consistent with some other peer communities. And it's gone up in the last 10, 15 years. And that translates to about $2,500 in affordable housing costs, looking at 30% of gross income. And so what can you afford if you earn that? And so here we have what you can afford at different income levels in Picken County, in Garfield County. And really, there's a reason that a lot of people are living in the Colorado River Valley. And that's because that's where housing is still somewhat affordable. That said, you still have to earn 120% of Picken County income that's sort of the entry point for those homes. And so what we can see is that the affordability challenges are just spreading further and further out. And so where someone used to be able to go buy a house in Newcastle and then still work in the valley, now they're looking out in like Rifle, Parachute, Silt. And so then we look at what is happening. And so we have these graphs for the Upper Valley and the Mid Valley. And this is just the number of sales affordable to households at different income levels. And one, we saw this, which, I'm sure we all saw in the community, the spike of sales in, 2020 and 2021, and it's come down, but still 80% of sales, you need to earn over $400,000 to afford that home in the Upper Valley. And then in the Mid Valley, it's still almost half of sales. And, the entry level to home ownership is still well over $100,000 of household income in these communities. And then we look at what people can afford, and what happens is this is what's affordable rent for different households at different income levels. But when you're making, $200,000 and can't afford to purchase a home, you go look for something to rent, and what you can pay is more than someone making $100,000 is definitely more than someone making $50,000, and so it pushes up the rental market because there's more demand for these units. And so what does this all mean? So this is why we're here. This is sort of the findings of this part of the study. And so we're looking at these in two ways. And so the catch up and keep up is sort of similar terminology to how we've looked at housing in the past. What's a little bit different is just the components of those. And so this is based on the state guidance. But essentially, we're looking at what housing need is currently on the ground based on current conditions. And so that is looking at overcrowding, temporary housing, so people, living on couches, living in their cars, reducing long-distance commuting, and then housing needs for unfilled jobs. And so when we see high levels of unfilled jobs, some of that is related to a need for housing. And so that is built into the current need. And then when we look at the future demand or this keep up, we're looking at employment growth and then retirements. And so why we look at retirement is because if someone currently works here and retires but stays living here, they've opened up a job but not a housing unit. And so that's not job growth, that job already existed, but there's not a one-to-one with the job and the housing unit. And so we include that in the future demand.
And there might even be an additional component to that. It's not that that person is no longer fulfilling that job. That home will likely be sold as a second home at some point in the future and will never fulfill jobs locally or the type of job category that the worker who was able to buy it 30 years ago did. So it's a little more of a double whammy. It's not just a job without a housing unit. It's a job that needs a new housing unit constructed.
Yeah, and that's a good piece to keep in mind moving forward as we get into strategies, and particularly the action plan once we wrap up the needs assessment, is are there ways for us to keep that housing unit in the local inventory and not have it sold as a second home or a non-primary home? Because what we know and what we've seen is once that happens, the base value of that unit changes because it's not valued as a local resident home, it's valued as, a ski home. And so it's a lot harder to get back once it's sold.
Yeah, and even if it's just they're retired there for a while, that's one thing. But when you look at a larger region like ours, you have different municipalities and counties with rules on short-term rentals. And so that can become another job generator out of that home as opposed to just a non, contributor one way or the other. But short-term rentals require employees.
Oh, definitely. And I've had the conversation with not this exact council, but a previous iteration of this council about the number of jobs that come out of short-term rentals. And that's definitely something as we get into the what do we do about this conversation, understanding all of those interconnections will be really important. As we go into the numbers, just to reiterate what Liz said at the beginning, that this is not a mandate to build this number of units. It's helping us understand the magnitude of need and what type of need it is, what general income levels, and start to help frame those conversations about policy and strategy. And so this is countywide. Over the next 10 years, we have a total need of about 2,850 housing units. And as you'll see in this piece of it, we're using APSHA income categories instead of just 30, 50, 80% AMI to help it align with existing programs. And so what we see is that the need is really concentrated in category 2 and category 3. And so we're gonna look at this in two ways. So this is what we're calling the gross need. This is everything based on our math. And then what you'll see is we will subtract out projects that are currently under construction or entitled and we anticipate them being built to look at what's left. And that's where those 2,850 units come from. So we're already accounting for what's in process. And so when we look at the overall need for the county, it's about 60-40 current need and projected future need. And part of that is just because of slow job growth. So the state is not forecasting really significant job growth for the county, and so that's keeping that future need somewhat lower. And then when we look at the split across the region, we think this really helps tell the story of what changes are happening. So when we look at the current need or that catch-up, it's about 50-50 Pickens County, Garfield County. When we look at the future need, it's 72% in Garfield County. And a lot of that is because that's where the job growth is expected to happen. And so we're really seeing this shift moving forward.
And is the future housing demand calculated based on already having fulfilled the existing housing demand?
No,
Or they're additive?
they're additive.
Okay, thank
And
you.
so, yeah, we'll see that, total units needed is the sum of the existing housing shortage and the projected housing need.
Thank you.
And so this, we just wanted to capture what we call the pipeline units. And so when we look at that total need, these are the units that we subtract out. And so lumberyard is doing a lot of work here. So we take those units out of the need. And so what we see are the numbers assuming that these projects get built.
Yeah, and I just think this is important to emphasize because that need includes what we already are building as well.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah.
And so then we get to this piece, which is what we call the net need, so that total need subtracting the pipeline units. And so it's about 7,200 units across the region, and about 2,550 in Pickens County. And so what we do, and this is part of the state mandate guidance, whatever we want to call it, is we distribute those needs according to jobs in the region. And so Aspen has over 50% of the jobs, and so over 50% of the housing need was allocated to Aspen, but then once those pipeline units are netted out, because most of the pipeline affordable housing is happening in Aspen, and so that share of the need goes down to 49% out of the county, and then the rest of it is distributed. You can see in that yellow box. And so we're looking at, for the city of Aspen, a net need of about 1,250 units over the next 10 years. And that's about 50-50 split between that existing shortage and future need.
You said 1,250?
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
1,246
And
units.
at about $1 million a unit with land costs and construction costs, that's a $125 million hole?
Oh, that's more than that. It's, yeah.
Or is
It's,
it a
it's a lot.
billion?
And that, so this, and not,
1.2 billion.
1.2 billion.
Yeah.
not that we're talking about Proposition 123 and the income limit petition and all of that, but part of that process also is helping the state understand differences
bad?
in development costs. And so, when they have limits on how much a project can get in funding, that money goes a lot further in, unincorporated Adams County than it does in Aspen. And so helping to understand that dynamic is just useful for state partners as they're, adjusting some of these programs. Because there are, in some cases, room for adjustment where the policy was set to start, and then I think as they go through and implement it and learn certain things, there can be room for adjustment. And so as part of, the narrative of that application, helping them to understand what the development costs are, not just on a grant basis, but also we need to include higher income units in these developments in order to balance out some of the lower income units. And that's just a function of development feasibility. And so this we just have, this is the last piece, is just specific to Aspen. And so there's a lot of numbers here, and this will all be in the report, but it just takes that, so we can see at the bottom there that 1,246 is that total number, and breaks it down into owner and renter and income level. And so there's a lot of assumptions in this, but it just helps, again, understand where to prioritize resources. And again, this is after what everything in the pipeline is being built. So this is like assuming lumberyard comes in and nets out some of this need.
The only thing I really feel a need to point out is the challenge we've had filling our low-income tax credit units. And whether it's because people earning a lower income work 2 jobs and therefore don't qualify or whatever, but we're never going to use low-income tax credits again. They're too inflexible, and when you see wages, maybe it was pandemic, COVID caused, suddenly increased 25%, and there's zero flexibility with the feds, we have units we have a very, very hard time filling. And so I cannot see us creating more of those super low income units.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a conversation that we've been having throughout this whole process, and we've been having with some of the partners at the state as well, where they say, like, we need to see need at the lower income levels. And we say, like, we understand that. And also, like, Liz has been working to pull data on how many vacancies there are in those units to be a part of some of this conversation, to say it just doesn't work here. And looking at the wages and looking at where the income levels are, generally speaking, if you're working, you don't qualify for those units.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that's absolutely a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's something that other communities need to be fully aware of, because, again, you've put your own money into constructing a project that you can't use.
Yeah.
And if anything the state could do, would be to lobby the feds to allow us a little more flexibility based on area median income or something like that. But it's very concerning. That's all. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one note on that, so you'll see the need in category 1 is only in that existing shortage. There's none of that need in the projected need. And so the existing shortage has to be distributed based on the current income distribution. And so there's a lot of intricacies in household income, and we can get into that another time, but there are, we have folks in that income category who currently live in the community. And so that's where that share comes from. In the future need, which is based on employment, that's where we don't see any of it. And that's where we really see that connection of wages to income level to qualifying for these units. And that's a story we're telling very strongly in this, particularly to help get that across, particularly to funding programs.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think it goes unsaid, but just to say it, any of the federal or the state money that may flow to these programs will only be doing deed-restricted units, not free market units.
For these programs, yeah, so Proposition 123 is for programmatic affordable housing. Yeah.
Deed-restricted.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Great.
There is a land banking program as part of Proposition 123, and I haven't read up on the details of it, but I believe it's land banking for affordable housing.
Okay.
Or other community needs.
Yeah, the last comment I would make is that your extremely to very low income category probably will work at some level for seniors as they retire from resort community jobs. Because when you've created housing for someone who's in a low-income job and they've given their 40 hard years of working time, they're going to be retiring in those units or in those communities. And so if there's ever a movement that we could create to help people like that, but I think we are going to be seeing retirements with people who may have a unit they can barely afford anymore, or just went from having that $100,000 medium income to now they're only going to be on $55,000 on Social Security and limited savings. And so that's a real consideration.
Yeah, and definitely as we get into the strategies and action planning, planning for things like that is going to be really important conversations to have, especially, a lot of communities that have really robust affordable housing programs for local employees. What happens when people retire is a big question, and is something that communities are kind of learning as they go. And so that's definitely going to be a big part of the conversation, and how do we plan for that, and then also considerations like downsizing and other things, and how do we start thinking about that to make sure that
full cycle.
Yeah,
of someone's
exactly.
life.
We talk about, the cycle or the ladder, and what rungs are broken, and can you move from one type of unit to another. And so as we get into the action planning conversations later on in this process, those are going to be really, really key conversations to have.
Thank you.
So just quickly, what we're doing next. So based on all the feedback that we get in all of these conversations, we're finalizing this initial document, and then working with staff across communities that are submitting the income limit petition to get that piece submitted, and then completing the rest of those components, like the housing problems, the market constraints, all of that, to flesh out the full Senate Bill 174 housing needs assessment, and then moving into the action planning. And so we're partway through this process. There's a lot to be done. There's different deadlines for different pieces, and so the action plan doesn't have to be completed for like another 2 years is like the full deadline, but, you know, obviously it should follow on relatively quickly from the needs assessment. But there's a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of conversations happening. So with that, any other questions that we didn't get to address throughout the discussion?
Council members, additional questions or comments?
I was asked one about, does this needs assessment take in carrying capacity in municipalities? I mean, and I always go to utilities. We only have so much water and resources, so there's only so much this population can grow to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the pieces, you know, we have to calculate the overall housing needs, and we've noted multiple times that that's not a development goal. It's not anything. Most communities won't address 100% of that. Also, in the second phase of this, water is a component that is now included in housing needs assessments based on Senate Bill 174, and that's a huge constraint. So there's one community that we were working in where, I don't remember exactly what their housing needs were, it was like maybe 100 and something units, and they have like 2 water tops left. And so not to say the housing needs number is meaningless, but, you know, they can do buy downs and other, you know, programs for existing inventory, but they're not building more housing, and that's just a fact of water. So absolutely.
Yeah, Sam, just to tag on for a half second, I do think the reports need to take geography into some consideration beyond water. When 80%, 85% of the county you live in is public lands, you know, the scarcity makes the land to develop on beyond imaginable compared to Front Range counties that just are expanding into farmland everywhere they can.
Yeah, absolutely. So one, land capacity is a piece of it, and then when we talk about the development limitations, the cost of land is a huge one, particularly here. And so all of those pieces are included as context, and that's why we're not saying we have to develop, you know, 1,200 new units. It's not realistic.
Thank you.
Actually,
you have a follow-up?
sorry, John. No, I just want to say on the other side of the coin, I don't know if this takes into consideration the growth side and, you know, giving recommendations to communities that you probably should grow at this pace, not add new hotels. I don't know, something along the lines of you're not going to be able to sustain your municipality if you continue to grow at a certain clip.
Or create jobs.
Something along those lines, like within like a reasonable actual frame of reference.
Yeah, I don't know that we get quite into that
Yeah.
level of recommendation, but that said, housing needs assessments are best when they're used in conjunction with other planning and policy efforts. So things like comprehensive plans, economic development plans, all of those things. You know, as we all know, housing's not a silo, and so we need to account for all of these other factors as well. And that's, you know, conversations we've had, for example, like with Telluride, of how much more lodging can we have with the community that we have.
Yep.
And so understanding those balances are really important for sure.
Thank you. That's all.
Good questions. John?
Yeah, I just want to say I think it's essential that we have a team working on this, gaining an understanding of what our future housing needs are going to be and get ahead of the curve on this. I'm also excited that this will possibly lead to a grant from DOLA in the future. So thanks for your hard work.
Other council member comments? You know, I'll make one kind of closing comment. I greatly appreciate both of your work and all the staff that's put into this. And I've been around the block a few times, so I remember we had a kind of housing assessment as part of our community plan, and we had EPS do one for us before, and it was when Mayor Clanderud was in office. And the one thing that the assessment came up with was you, Aspen, need X many more units. But I was the one who kept insisting, wait, there's got to be a footnote here about we only need X many more units if all the remaining stock remains affordable, which was free market, which of course it didn't. And so those numbers were pie in the sky to begin with. And so I think that that's the one thing that this housing inventory needs to take a future look at, is the demand for free market homes, for second homes throughout Colorado. When I was in Mesa County, that's what their housing crisis, there's all sorts of people retiring to this beautiful, warm area in Colorado. And so how do we account for the loss of the inventory we're talking about now to those sort of outside pressures? And I think we need to make sure that's accounted for in the larger statewide process. We're already pretty aware of losing our inventory to the prices in second home ownership.
Yeah, and it's a really important context. It's something in Eagle County we tried to quantify by looking at the assessor records and sale records and seeing if we could get a number of how many locally owned homes
Free
were
market
sold to
homes.
non-local buyers. It's hard to get and hard to track, but if nothing else, quantitatively, it's definitely a factor that needs to, and it's, to your point, a big assumption of we're assuming that conditions remain stable and this all happens on top of that.
And it won't.
Right, and that's where, again, not to keep plugging the action plan, but as we move into that, understanding stabilization strategies, and it's not just about building, it is about keeping the inventory we already have and what are the tools available to do
Yeah,
that.
and that's why we participated with so many other governments and individuals in trying to preserve a mobile home park in Mid-Valley, so.
Yep.
I would add one other footnote that it's, when you're talking about kind of things that are not quantifiable, this is a housing needs assessment, and there's the housing wants as well. And I think that we've all heard there is a shifting number of people who don't necessarily want to live in Aspen because they can get a garage and they can get bedrooms and more space down Valley. So the housing needs versus the actual housing wants, I don't know how you account for that or color it into the study, but I think that's part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something,
Great point.
we did some work with RAFTA, we're just wrapping up work with Roaring Fork School District, and so there's pieces of that in some of the outreach we've done for them. The biggest way to do that is a survey, and we had some timing constraints on this study, and so we weren't able to incorporate that in, but it is something that, to your point, we know is a factor for sure, and, for the same amount of money, it's the same idea of people moving to suburbs in
Yeah.
cities, just exacerbated.
Yeah, just not having shared walls,
Yeah.
roommates above you who still party late at night, and maybe a HOA that allows pets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Things like that make a lot of difference.
Yeah.
Again, any final questions or comments? Well, I think that was pretty much all. Pete, did you have any announcements for us or anything tonight?
Do not for tonight.
Okay. Well, very good. We will call the end of the meeting. Hopefully you can get to Snowmass in time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For everything, and thank you for being here, Lucy, and the staff. So,
Thanks.
bye-bye, Grassroots. We'll see you next time.